Good morning, Admiral. The words landed in the middle of my wedding reception like a stone dropped into still water. Conversation stopped. Forks hovered mid-air. Chairs scraped as people turned. I remember the sound of fabric shifting, dozens of guests twisting in their seats at once, trying to understand who the man in the tailored navy suit was speaking to. He was standing straight, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on me. And then he saluted. For a moment no one moved, not even me. Across the room I saw Harold, my soon-to-be father-in-law, go pale. His confident smile collapsed, his jaw loosening as if someone had cut the strings holding it in place. But that moment didn't begin there. It began long before the wedding, long before Harold's words cut through me in front of everyone I had come to call family. It began with a choice I made years ago to live quietly. I've never been the kind of woman who needed attention. After I retired, I moved to a small coastal town in Virginia just outside Norfolk. It was the kind of place where mornings started with the sound of gulls and ended with neighbors waving from their porches. Nothing fancy, just steady, familiar, and honest. I liked it that way. My house was modest, white siding, a narrow front porch, and a garden I tended myself. I grew tomatoes in the summer-trimmed hedges in the fall, and kept a small American flag by the door, not out of habit but out of respect. Most people in town knew me simply as Evelyn. Not ma'am, not commander, not admiral. Just Evelyn. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I met Richard at a community fundraiser. It was one of those local events where everyone brings a dish and someone inevitably burns the casserole. I had made lemon bars. He had brought store-bought cookies and apologized for them before anyone even tasted one. He was kind in a way that felt rare these days. Not loud, not showy, just present. We talked for nearly an hour that night. About books, about the ocean, about how strange it felt to start over later in life. He told me he'd been widowed for 5 years. I told him I understood loss. Neither of us asked too many questions. That was the beginning. Richard never pressed me about my past. He knew I had worked in government, and that seemed to satisfy him. Maybe it was his generation he understood that some things didn't need to be said out loud. Or maybe he trusted me enough not to ask. Either way, I was grateful. Because the truth was, I didn't want to be known for what I had been. I wanted to be known for who I was. Richard's family, on the other hand, was different. They were respectable people, established, the kind who took pride in their name and made sure others knew it. His father, Harold, had spent decades working in federal contracting. He carried himself like a man who had earned every ounce of his success and expected acknowledgement for it. The first time I met him, he shook my hand firmly and looked me up and down in a way that felt more like an evaluation than a greeting. So he said, "Richard tells me you've had a quiet career." I smiled politely. "I suppose you could say that." He nodded, but there was something behind his eyes. Curiosity maybe, or doubt. I had seen that look before. Over the next few months, as Richard and I grew closer, Harold's tone didn't change. He wasn't openly rude, not at first. But there were comments. Small ones, careful ones. The kind that could be brushed off if you didn't want to make a scene. I imagine retirement must be easier when expectations weren't too high to begin with. You've done well for yourself, considering. Richard's always had a generous heart. I learned to let them pass. At my age, you learn which battles are worth fighting, and which ones aren't. Richard didn't see it. Or maybe he saw pieces of it but didn't understand the full picture. He loved his father, respected him. And Harold wasn't used to being challenged. So I chose peace. When Richard proposed, it was simple. We were sitting on my porch watching the sun settle into the water. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box, and said, "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left without you." There was no grand speech. No audience. Just honesty. I said yes. Planning the wedding brought the families together more often. That's when the tension became harder to ignore. Harold began asking more direct questions. "What exactly did you do in government? Was it administrative work policy? And your pension, is it sufficient?" I answered carefully, always respectfully. "I worked in operations. It was a long career. I'm comfortable." But it wasn't enough for him. He wanted specifics. He wanted something he could measure. Something he could place on his internal scale of worth. One afternoon during a planning lunch, he leaned back in his chair and said, You know, Evelyn, a marriage isn't just about companionship. It's about standing, about reputation. I met his gaze calmly. I agree. He nodded satisfied for a moment, then added, I just want to be sure my son isn't settling. The table went quiet. Richard shifted in his seat. Dad. But I placed my hand gently over Richard's. It's all right, I said softly. And it was. Not because his words didn't matter, but because I had spent a lifetime learning that people often reveal more about themselves than they intend. Still, I could feel it building. The unspoken judgment. The assumptions. The quiet dismissal. And I knew sooner or later it would surface. Not in private, but where it would matter most. Looking back now, I realize I had a choice. I could have told them everything. Laid it all out. My career, my rank, my history. I could have ended the questions before they even began. But that wouldn't have changed who they were. And it wouldn't have shown me who they truly were either. So I stayed silent. And I waited. Because respect that depends on titles isn't respect at all. And on the day of my wedding, I would finally see just how far that truth would go. By the week of the wedding, I had learned something I think most people discover eventually. If they live long enough, not every family greets change with warmth, even when they call it happiness. Richard and I were getting married on a Saturday in late May in a small Episcopal church near the waterfront. Nothing extravagant. Fresh flowers, a reception at the local yacht club, and a guest list mostly made up of family old friends and people from the community who had known one or both of us for years. It was the sort of wedding people our age appreciate, elegant, without fuss, warm, without spectacle. That was what I wanted. At my age, a wedding isn't about proving anything. It isn't about a grand entrance or a dramatic display. It's about making a promise with clear eyes and a grateful heart. Richard understood that. He wanted the same thing I did, a peaceful day, a meaningful ceremony, and the comfort of beginning a new chapter without pretending we were 25. But peace, I was beginning to understand, was not something Harold intended to offer me. The trouble with men like him is not that they're loud. Loud men can be dealt with. You know where they stand. You hear them coming. The difficult ones are the polished men, the respectable men, the ones who smile while they diminish you, and then act surprised when you notice. Harold had perfected that style over a lifetime. 3 days before the wedding, Richard and I drove to his parents' house for a small family dinner. His mother, Diane, had made pot roast and green beans, and the dining room looked exactly as it always had. China cabinet, polished table runner, pressed silverware laid out with the care of people raised to believe that proper manners could hold a family together. Diane herself was gentle but quiet in the way some women become after decades of accommodating a stronger personality. She was never unkind to me. In fact, I think she liked me. But liking someone and standing up for them are not always the same thing. Richard's younger sister, Marianne, was there too, along with her husband, Kent. Marianne was pleasant enough, though she carried a kind of social alertness that made her seem always to be measuring the room. Kent was one of those men who spoke very little until he had something sharp to say. Dinner started smoothly. Diane asked about the flowers. Marianne wanted to know whether I had chosen ivory or white for my dress. Richard talked about the seating chart. For nearly 20 minutes the meal felt normal. Then Harold set down his water glass and turned to me. So, Evelyn, he said with that polished tone of his I've been meaning to ask, what was your title exactly? The table quieted. I cut a small piece of roast and answered the same way I had before. I worked in naval operations. That's not really a title, he said. No, I replied calmly, it's not. He gave a short laugh as if I had confirmed something for him. Well, I suppose some jobs are harder to explain than others. Richard looked up. Dad. What Harold said, lifting his hands slightly, I'm making conversation. But he wasn't. We all knew that. I sipped my iced tea and let the moment pass. That was one of the habits service had taught me better than anything else. Silence can be its own form of control. You do not answer every provocation. You do not rise to every baited line. Sometimes you let a person keep talking until they show everyone at the table exactly who they are. Harold turned to Richard. I'm just surprised, that's all. A man ought to know the details before marriage. Richard's face tightened. I know enough. Harold looked at him for a long second. Do you? Diane immediately reached for the breadbasket as if dinner could be rescued by carbohydrates. Who wants another roll? No one answered. I set down my fork and met Harold's eyes. Richard knows what matters. His expression sharpened just slightly. That depends on your definition of matters. There it was again. Not quite an insult. Not quite a question. Just enough poison to settle into the conversation without making a stain anyone else felt obligated to clean up. Marianne cleared her throat. Dad, really? But Harold was in no mood to retreat. I'm only saying, he continued, that marriage is serious, at our age especially. Finances, background stability, these aren't things you gloss over. Richard pushed back from the table a little. We haven't glossed over anything. Harold gave a thin smile. You say that now? I could feel the heat of everyone's discomfort spreading through the room, but inside myself I stayed cool. That had always been my refuge. Calm is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision not to let feeling drive the ship. I've done very well taking care of myself, I said. Harold nodded slowly. I'm sure you believe that. The words hung there. Marianne stared at her plate. Kent reached for his drink and said nothing. Diane looked stricken. Richard was halfway between anger and embarrassment, which is an unhappy place for a grown son to be. And in that moment I understood something important. Harold did not simply disapprove of me. He resented the fact that I would not present myself for inspection. Men like him are comfortable with resumes. They understand pedigree, salary, job titles, family background. Those things help them sort people into categories that make them feel secure. But a woman who remains self-contained, who answers politely without volunteering more than she chooses, unsettles them. She cannot be ranked so easily. That was what bothered him. Not my past. My refusal to place it in his hands. After dinner, while Diane and Marianne cleared the table, I stepped out onto the back patio for air. The evening was mild, the sky washed in that soft, golden light you get just before sunset. Their yard backed up to a stretch of trees, and for a moment all I could hear were birds and the distant hum of traffic. Richard came out a minute later and closed the screen door behind him. I'm sorry, he said. I leaned against the railing. You don't need to apologize for your father's manners. Yes, I do. He rubbed the back of his neck. He's been worse than usual. I looked at him. Has he? Richard let out a tired breath and gave me a sheepish look. No, probably not. I just kept hoping he'd settle down. I smiled, though there was sadness in it. People don't usually become kinder because there's a wedding. He looked away, then back at me. You could tell me, you know. Tell you what. Whatever it is you're not saying. His voice was gentle, not accusing. I've never pushed because I didn't want to pry, but sometimes I feel like there's this whole part of your life standing quietly behind you, and I'm the only one in the room who can't see it. That touched me more deeply than Harold's barbs ever could. I folded my hands in front of me. Richard, there are parts of my life I don't talk about because I spent years living in places where talking too much wasn't wise, and after a while privacy becomes less of a habit and more of a comfort. I know, he said, but I'm not your commanding officer. I'm the man marrying you. There was pain in his voice, and that pained me. So I stepped closer and rested my hand on his arm. And I love you for your heart, not your questions. He covered my hand with his. That's not an answer. No, I said softly, it isn't. We stood there together for a few seconds in the fading light. Then I said the only thing I could say honestly. There are things I will tell you, but I want to do it in my own time. Richard studied my face, then nodded. All right. It was one of the reasons I loved him. He knew how to leave a door open without forcing it wider. Inside, I could hear Diane calling that dessert was ready. We went back in together. Harold was sitting at the head of the table as if nothing had happened, which was his specialty. Men who wound people often prefer to act as though the wound is imaginary. The next day brought more of the same. At the final meeting with the reception coordinator, Harold questioned the guest list, the seating chart, even the choice of music. Every objection of his somehow circled back to me. Do you know these people well enough to invite them? Are you sure your side isn't a little sparse? I suppose second marriages are always harder to organize. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His contempt was refined, polished smooth by decades of practice. And still I held my tongue. Not because I was weak, not because I was afraid, but because age teaches you that timing matters. There is a difference between defending yourself and revealing someone else. One is impulse, the other is truth. By Friday night, the evening before the wedding, I was alone in my guest room at Richard's house, laying out the blue silk dress I would wear to the rehearsal dinner. My garment bag for the wedding hung nearby. On the dresser sat a small jewelry box, and inside it, wrapped in tissue, was an item I had not worn in years. I opened the box and looked at it for a long moment. Then I closed it again. Not yet. Outside the room, I could hear low voices, Richard on the phone, Diane moving dishes in the kitchen, Harold talking somewhere down the hall. The house was full of that tense, overmanaged quiet families create when they are trying to force harmony before a major event. I sat down on the edge of the bed and smoothed the dress over my knees. I had spent a lifetime in rooms where pressure could turn a situation dangerous in seconds. Compared to that, a difficult family wedding should have been simple. And yet I felt it deep in my bones. Something was coming. Harold wasn't finished. He had been building toward something all week, testing boundaries, probing for weakness, trying to place me beneath him in whatever invisible hierarchy he carried around in his mind. And tomorrow, with a room full of witnesses and nowhere left for courtesy to hide, I suspected he would finally say exactly what he thought of me. I also suspected he would regret it. I woke before dawn on my wedding day, the way I used to wake before inspections, before briefings, before flights out over uncertain water. Old habits remain in the body long after the uniform is folded away. For a few quiet minutes I lay still and listened to the house settle around me. Pipes clicked faintly in the walls. Somewhere downstairs a floorboard creaked. Outside a gull cried over the water. Virginia mornings near the coast have a softness to them in late May, a gray-blue light that makes everything feel held in suspension, as if the day has not yet decided what it means to become. I remember thinking before my feet even touched the floor that this would be one of those days a person carries forever. Not because of the flowers or photographs, and not because of the cake or music. Those things matter in the moment, but they fade. What lasts is how people reveal themselves when emotion rises and the room is watching. By 8 o'clock, the house was gently alive. Diane moved through the kitchen in her robe, making coffee for everyone and pretending she wasn't nervous. Marianne arrived with garment bags, hairpins, and a voice an octave too bright. Richard had left early for the church with Kent, and I was grateful for that. I needed the morning to gather myself. My dress was simple and elegant ivory silk with long sleeves and a modest neckline. At our age, there is a dignity in not trying to reclaim youth. I didn't want to look young. I wanted to look like myself at peace. As Marianne zipped the back for me, she caught my eyes in the mirror. "You look beautiful," she said. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I'm sorry about Dad." I turned slightly. "That's kind of you." Her face tightened. "He gets fixed on things." "Yes," I said, "I've noticed." She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Once he decides he understands a person, he doesn't really leave room to be wrong." That was one of the truest things anyone in that family had said. I studied her reflection for a moment and saw not just discomfort but fatigue. Children of strong fathers often spend years learning how to manage a weather system they did not create. "You don't have to carry responsibility for him," I told her. She lowered her eyes. "Maybe not, but somehow we all do." That stayed with me. The ceremony itself was lovely. The church was small, white, and full of warm morning light. Friends from town filled the pews. Richard stood at the front, looking handsome and a little overwhelmed, his gray suit pressed perfectly, his hands clasped too tightly. When he saw me step into the aisle, his whole face changed. Not dramatically, just softly. His shoulders eased. His mouth trembled into a smile that held gratitude and disbelief all at once. That expression alone would have been enough to carry me through the day. The minister spoke simply without flourish. Richard's voice caught when he said his vows. Mine remained steady, though I felt more than I showed. I had stood in rooms with secretaries, senators, foreign officers, and battle groups hanging on my words. Yet nothing in my professional life had ever felt as intimate as promising one man before God and family that I would walk beside him for whatever years remained to us. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the church rose in applause. Richard kissed me gently. For a few precious moments, everything Harold had said and implied over the past months faded into the background. The only thing that felt real was the ring on my hand and the warmth of Richard's palm against mine. I wish that had lasted. The reception was held at a yacht club overlooking the water. It wasn't as grand as the name suggests. More old local prestige than modern luxury. Polished wood floors, white tablecloths, brass fixtures framed regatta photographs on the walls. The kind of place where retirees hold anniversary parties and civic boards gather for fundraisers. Comfortable, tasteful, familiar. By early afternoon, the room was full of laughter, clinking glasses, and the easy hum of conversation. The food was good. A trio played standards in the corner. People came up to our table with stories, blessings, warm handshakes. For a while, I let myself believe Harold might preserve the day after all. He moved through the room with his usual confidence, greeting old contacts, shaking hands, patting backs. To anyone who didn't know him well, he looked like a proud father hosting a family celebration. That was part of what made men like Harold difficult. They often save their sharpest edges for private moments, or for moments when social pressure protects them. I noticed he'd had more than one drink, though not enough to slur, just enough to loosen whatever restraint he usually wore. When it came time for speeches, Richard stood first. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked Diane for helping with the arrangements, thanked Marianne for stepping in wherever needed. Then he turned to me. His words were brief and heartfelt. He said that meeting me had made the second half of his life feel unexpectedly full. He said I brought steadiness to his days and joy to his home. He said love at our age wasn't smaller than young love, it was deeper because it arrived carrying memory loss and choice. There wasn't a dry eye at our table. I squeezed his hand when he sat down. Then Harold rose. He lifted his glass and smiled, waiting for the room to settle. His posture was relaxed, practiced. He had likely imagined himself at the center of this moment for weeks. Well, he began, "This is certainly a memorable day." There were a few polite chuckles. "I've watched my son walk through some hard years," he continued. "Losing a wife changes a man. It leaves him vulnerable in ways he may not even recognize." I felt Richard shift beside me. Harold went on. "So when a new person comes along later in life, naturally a father asks questions." The smile on his face remained, but his eyes had sharpened. A few guests looked between us, sensing some current under the words. And I'll admit he said I had my concerns. Richard set down his fork. "Dad." Harold waved a hand lightly, still smiling. No, hear me out. I'm speaking honestly. That's what families should do." A murmur passed through the room. Diane stared at the tablecloth. Harold turned slightly enough to include me without fully facing me. "You see, Evelyn has always been something of a mystery to us." I sat very still. "She's private," he said. "Very private," which in itself is fine. But when a woman enters a family and keeps so much hidden, people naturally wonder what exactly is being hidden. The room had gone almost silent now. Somewhere near the back, a glass was set down too hard. Richard stood halfway. "That's enough." But Harold continued, his voice a little stronger now, a little less polished. "My son is a decent man. A trusting man. Maybe too trusting. And I'll say what others may have been too polite to say when someone appears out of nowhere with vague stories about government work and a quiet life. A man is entitled to ask whether she's there for love or for security." The words hit the room like a slap. I heard Marianne suck in a breath. Diane looked as if she might cry. Several guests turned toward me immediately, not with suspicion, but with the helpless attention people give a person who has just been publicly struck. Richard pushed back his chair and stood. "You need to stop. Right now." Harold flushed with the terrible courage of a man who mistakes an audience for agreement, pressed on. "I'm only protecting my son. If that embarrasses anyone, so be it." Then he looked directly at me. "For all we know, he said you spent your career pushing papers in some office and learned just enough to make yourself sound important. But this family doesn't owe respect based on vague hints and polished manners." The silence that followed was unlike ordinary silence. It had weight, shame, shock, the sound of 100 people realizing together that something had gone too far. Richard turned to me horrified. "Evelyn." But I placed my hand gently over his wrist. "It's all right," I said. And strangely it was, because humiliation only works when you accept the measure being used against you. Harold thought he was stripping something away from me, but he could only strip away the illusion he had built for others. He had no access to what I actually was. I rose slowly from my seat. Not angrily, not dramatically. Just calmly. Every eye in the room followed me. Harold's face was flushed, but I could see the first hint of uncertainty flicker there. Bullies count on immediate collapse, not composure. They know what to do with tears. They know what to do with shouting. Calm confuses them. I looked at him and said in an even voice, "You are entitled to your opinions, Harold, but you are not entitled to invent my life simply because I declined to perform it for your approval." A few people lowered their eyes. A few others nodded almost imperceptibly. Harold gave a brittle laugh. "Then perhaps you'd like to enlighten us." There it was, the invitation, public, smug, and poisoned. I could have answered then. I could have ended everything with one sentence. Instead, I said no, I don't think I need to. That unsettled him more than anger would have. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to say something even crueler, when the doors at the back of the reception room opened. At first, no one paid much attention. Just another late guest, perhaps. But then the room's focus shifted in a way I recognized instantly. Heads turned not from curiosity, but from the subtle force of authority entering a space. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, silver-haired, straight-backed, carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Two others followed behind him, though they remained a respectful distance back. Harold's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. He knew him. And as the man moved through the parted crowd, his gaze fixed not on Harold, not on Richard, but on me, I realized that the day Harold had worked so hard to control had finally slipped beyond his reach. The room seemed to hold its breath as the man approached. I recognized him immediately, though it had been years since we had last stood in the same room. Time had etched deeper lines into his face, and his hair had gone fully silver, but his posture hadn't changed. It never would. Men like him don't forget who they are even when the uniform comes off. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitaker. Harold's superior. And once long ago, mine in a different chain of command. He walked past tables of guests who instinctively moved aside, though most of them didn't understand why. There's a certain presence that doesn't need explanation. It's felt, not announced. When he reached me, he stopped. Straightened. And then, in one smooth, unmistakable motion, he raised his hand in a formal salute. "Good morning, Admiral." You could have heard a pin drop. The words didn't echo, but they carried, across every table, through every whispered assumption, into every corner of that room where people had just watched me be measured and dismissed. For a moment I didn't move. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood exactly what this moment meant. Then quietly I returned the salute. "Good morning, Tom," I said. Not loudly, not for effect. Just enough. A ripple passed through the room, sharp inhales, chairs, shifting, the soft clatter of someone setting down a glass too quickly. I turned slightly and looked at Harold. His face had drained of color completely now. The confidence, the authority he had worn like a well-tailored jacket all afternoon, it was gone. In its place was something far more honest. Shock. And beneath it, fear. His mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. That more than anything told me he understood. Whitaker lowered his hand and gave me a small, respectful nod. Then, as if remembering where he was, he glanced around the room. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," he said, addressing no one in particular. "I was informed of the event late, but I felt it would be appropriate to attend." His eyes flickered briefly toward Harold. There was no hostility there. Just clarity. Harold swallowed hard. "Admiral, I didn't realize." Whitaker's expression didn't change. "No," he said calmly. "You didn't." That was all. No reprimand, no raised voice. But it landed heavier than anything Harold had said all day. I could feel every eye on me now. Not curious anymore. Not skeptical. Something else. Recognition, perhaps? Or the uneasy awareness that they had just witnessed something shift in a way they couldn't take back. Richard stood beside me, completely still. "Evelyn," he said quietly. I turned to him. There was no accusation in his face, no anger. Only confusion, and something like awe. I reached for his hand. "I was going to tell you," I said softly. "I know," he replied. And I believed him. Whitaker stepped slightly to the side, giving me space but remaining present like a silent anchor in the room. One of the guests, an older gentleman I recognized from town, leaned toward another and whispered not quite quietly enough, "Did he say, Admiral?" The answer came not in words, but in the way the room had already changed. People were sitting straighter now, listening differently. Even those who didn't fully understand military ranks knew enough to recognize the significance. Harold, however, understood exactly. He took a step toward me, then stopped halfway as if unsure whether he had the right to come any closer. "Evelyn," he said, his voice unsteady, I had no idea." I met his eyes. "I know," I said. That was the truth. He hadn't known, but he had assumed. And that had been the real problem all along. Diane rose slowly from her seat, her hand pressed lightly to her chest. "My goodness," she whispered. "All this time." Marianne looked between me and Whitaker, her expression somewhere between disbelief and realization. Kent for once had nothing to say at all. Harold tried again. "If I'd known—" I stopped him gently but firmly. "If you'd known I said, you would have treated me differently." He hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "And that I said is exactly why I didn't tell you." The room absorbed that. Not just Harold. Everyone. Because what I had said wasn't complicated. But it was undeniable. Whitaker folded his hands behind his back, his posture relaxed but precise. "Admiral Carter," he said, turning slightly toward the room, served with distinction for over 3 decades. She commanded operations most people in this room will never hear about, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. I felt a flicker of discomfort at that. I had never been one for public praise. "Tom," I said quietly. He inclined his head, just stating facts. Then he added more gently, "Facts that should have been recognized long before today." Harold flinched. I took a slow breath. This was the moment I realized not the salute, not the revelation, but what came after. This was where things could turn into something bitter. Or something better. I looked around the room. At the guests who had watched in silence. At Diane, who looked ashamed. At Marianne, who looked thoughtful. At Richard, who looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time and yet somehow more clearly than ever. And finally back at Harold. His shoulders had lowered. His certainty was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen before. Humility. I didn't keep my past a secret to deceive anyone. I said, my voice calm but steady enough to carry. I kept it private because I wanted to live the rest of my life as a person, not as a rank. No one interrupted. I've spent years in rooms where titles mattered, where authority had to be clear, where decisions had consequences that couldn't be undone. I paused. But this, I gestured lightly around the room, this was supposed to be different. My gaze settled on Harold again. This was supposed to be about family. Harold's eyes dropped. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out quietly. Not polished. Not practiced. Just real. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Diane moved first. She stepped toward me, her eyes filled with something soft and regretful. "Evelyn," she said, "I'm so sorry. I should have said something." I reached out and touched her hand. "You're saying it now." That seemed to matter to her. Richard finally exhaled a breath he'd been holding far too long. "Well," he said with a faint disbelieving smile, "I guess I should have asked a few more questions." A light ripple of laughter moved through the room, not mocking, not sharp, but relieved. The tension cracked. Just a little. Whitaker stepped back slightly, his role in the moment complete. "I'll leave you to your celebration," he said. I nodded. "Thank you for coming." He gave me one last respectful look. "Always Admiral." Then he turned and walked back through the room, the quiet authority he carried, leaving a different kind of silence behind him. As the doors closed, the weight in the room shifted again. Not gone, but changed. What had been humiliation was now something else. Reckoning. Understanding. And perhaps the beginning of something better. Harold remained where he stood, still processing. Then slowly, almost as if it cost him something, he took another step toward me. This time he didn't stop. And for the first time since I had met him, he looked at me not as someone to evaluate, but as someone he needed to understand. For a while after the doors closed behind Admiral Whitaker, no one seemed quite sure what to do next. The music had stopped at some point I hadn't even noticed when, and the trio in the corner sat quietly with their instruments resting in their laps, waiting for someone to signal that it was all right to begin again. Glasses remained half-raised. Conversations hung unfinished. Moments like that don't resolve all at once. They settle slowly like dust after something has been shaken loose. Richard was still standing beside me, his hand wrapped firmly around mine now, as if he needed to anchor himself to something steady. "You were a Navy Admiral," he said quietly. I nodded, yes. He let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh. "That's not exactly small detail." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." He studied my face, searching not for answers, I realized, but for reassurance. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. There was no accusation in it, just hurt and curiosity. I turned slightly so we were facing each other fully, even though the room was still watching. "Because I wanted you to see me," I said, "not what I used to be." His brow furrowed. "I do see you." "I know," I said gently, "but I needed to know that first." That seemed to settle something in him. He nodded slowly. "You're right." And then, after a pause, he added, "I just wish I had known what you were carrying." That word stayed with me. Carrying. Because that's what a life like mine becomes eventually. Not a badge, not a title. A weight. Around us, the room began to stir again. Not loudly, not abruptly, but carefully. A few guests resumed quiet conversations. Chairs shifted. Someone signaled to the musicians, and soft piano notes began to fill the space again, gentle and unobtrusive. But the atmosphere had changed. People were looking at me differently now. Not just with curiosity. With respect. And in some cases with a kind of distance that hadn't been there before. That more than anything was what I had always tried to avoid. Diane approached again, this time more composed. "Evelyn," she said, "I can't imagine the responsibility you must have carried all those years." I smiled faintly. It wasn't something I carried alone. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she fully understood. Few people outside that world ever do. Marianne stepped forward next. "I feel like I owe you an apology too," she said. "For what?" "For not seeing what was happening. Or maybe seeing it and not saying anything." I considered that. Then I shook my head. "You're not responsible for someone else's behavior." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. I still wish I had said something, she admitted. "That's fair," I said. And it was. Across the room I saw Harold still standing near his chair. He hadn't moved much since the moment everything changed. His glass sat untouched in his hand. He wasn't looking at me now. He was looking down. I had seen that posture before too. Not in men who had been defeated, but in men who had just realized they had been wrong. There's a difference. Defeat closes a man. Understanding opens him. After a few minutes, he finally walked toward us. Not with his usual confidence. Not with that careful, measured authority he carried like a second skin. Just slowly. When he reached us, he didn't speak right away. He set his glass down on the nearest table, cleared his throat, then looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room quieted again, not completely, but enough that those closest could hear. "I spoke out of turn," he continued, "and out of assumption." I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. He didn't flinch. "I judged you based on what I didn't know," he went on. "And instead of asking with respect, I pushed. I made it public when it should have remained private." There was no defensiveness in his voice now. No justification. Just acknowledgement. That matters more than most people realize. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, he added, "If I had known who you were." I shook my head gently. "That's not the point." He stopped. And for the first time, I saw him really listening. "The problem isn't that you didn't know my rank," I said. "The problem is that you believed respect should depend on it." The words were quiet. But they carried. He absorbed that slowly. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "You're right." That couldn't have been easy for him. Men like Harold build their lives on certainty. Admitting fault isn't just uncomfortable, it's disorienting. I spent my entire career in a system where rank mattered, I continued. It had to. People needed to know who was responsible, who made decisions, who answered for outcomes. He nodded slightly. "But outside of that system," I said, "rank is just a word. It doesn't define who a person is." I let that sit for a moment. "Character does." Harold looked down again. Then back up. And I misjudged yours, he said. Yes, I replied. There was no need to soften it. Truth doesn't require decoration. He exhaled slowly. I won't pretend I can undo what I said, he admitted, but I would like the chance to do better. That more than the apology itself told me something had shifted. Because doing better requires more than regret. It requires change. I studied him for a moment. Then I nodded. That's all anyone can ask. There was a small release in the room after that. Not dramatic, but real. Conversations resumed more naturally. The music picked up a little. Someone laughed at something across the room, and it didn't feel out of place anymore. Richard squeezed my hand. You handled that better than I would have, he said quietly. I smiled. That's why you married me. He chuckled softly, among other reasons. As the afternoon continued, people approached me one by one. Some offered congratulations. Some asked respectful questions about my service. Others simply shook my hand and said nothing at all. I answered what I chose to answer, and left the rest where it belonged, in the past. But through it all, one thing remained clear in my mind. Respect that arrives only after revelation is not the same as respect that exists from the beginning. And yet sometimes it's the only kind people are capable of at first. What matters is whether they learn to offer it without conditions. As I looked around the room at Richard, at Diane, at Marianne, and even at Harold, now speaking more quietly than I had ever seen him, I realized something I hadn't expected. This day hadn't just revealed who I was. It had revealed who they were. And more importantly, who they might still become. By the time the sun had begun to lower over the marina, the reception had softened into something quieter and more honest than it had been all afternoon. The shock had worn off. The whispers had thinned. People were no longer looking at me with that startled, searching expression they'd had after Admiral Whitaker's salute. They were looking at me more normally now, though, perhaps with a little more care than before. I was grateful for that. I had no desire to spend the rest of my wedding day as a spectacle. Richard and I had managed one slow dance, just one. The band was playing an old standard something from the 60s, warm and familiar, and we moved carefully across the floor with the kind of restraint that comes from years, not from lack of feeling. His hand rested lightly at my back. My head was near his shoulder. Neither of us spoke for the first minute or so. Finally, he said, I keep replaying the whole day in my mind. That's usually a sign of shock, I said. He gave a quiet laugh. That obvious? A little. We kept moving. Then he said more seriously, I'm not upset that you were an admiral. I certainly hope not. That brought another small laugh from him. I'm upset, he said, that you felt you had to carry that alone. I drew back just enough to see his face. It wasn't about carrying it alone. Then what was it about? I took a breath. It was about leaving it where it belonged. He studied me, listening. When you spend years in command, I said, people stop seeing the person and start seeing the structure around her. The rank, the authority, the expectations. Even after retirement, it follows you. People either stiffen around you or perform for you. I didn't want that with you. And you thought telling me would change that? I didn't know, I said honestly, but I knew I didn't want to begin our life together inside a title I had already spent a lifetime carrying. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. I can understand that. I smiled a little. You don't have to understand all of it. I know, he said, but I'd like to understand more than I did this morning. That touched me. So I rested my head against his shoulder again and let the music carry us the rest of the way through the song. When it ended, he kissed my temple and said, whatever you tell me from here on out, tell me because you want to, not because anyone forced the moment. That was Richard all over. A decent man in an indecent moment, still trying to make room for grace. A little later, after coffee had been served and the cake had been cut, I stepped outside to the club's back terrace for air. The evening was cool and clear. The water beyond the railing had turned a deep blue-gray, and boat masts rocked gently in the slips below. From inside came the softened sound of conversation and silverware blurred now by glass and distance. I stood there for a minute by myself, one hand resting on the railing, letting the quiet settle my nerves. I thought I might find you out here. I turned. Harold stood in the open doorway. For once he did not look like a man entering a room he expected to control. He looked older than he had that morning, not frail, just stripped of some invisible armor. I didn't speak, I simply waited. He came a few steps closer, then stopped at what felt like a respectful distance. "I won't keep you long," he said. "That would be appreciated." He nodded, accepting that. For a moment he looked out at the water instead of at me. "I've spent most of my life believing I could read people quickly," he said. "It served me well in business." Or so I told myself. I folded my hands loosely in front of me, and today, he gave a humorless little smile. Today I found out there's a difference between reading people and sorting them. That was better than I expected from him. He turned to me, then his expression plain, unguarded. "I was cruel to you." "Yes," I said. "I embarrassed my son." "Yes." "I embarrassed myself." I let that sit for a beat. Also, yes. For the first time all day, something almost like humility passed between us without resistance. It didn't fix anything, but it cleared the air. He slipped one hand into his pocket and exhaled slowly. "I've been trying to understand why I reacted to you the way I did." "Have you?" "I think so." He looked down briefly, then back at me. "You made me feel irrelevant." That surprised me, not because it was impossible, but because he admitted it. I said nothing, and he went on. "Richard listens to you in a way he stopped listening to me years ago, not out of disrespect, just because he trusts you. And the less you explained yourself, the more I felt shut out. I told myself I was protecting him, but the truth is, I didn't like not being the one with authority. There it was. Not class anxiety, not suspicion, not even disapproval at the core of it. Fear. The ordinary fear of a man aging out of the role he had built his identity around. I had seen versions of that fear before in officers facing retirement and politicians, after elections in men who mistake usefulness for control, and then don't know who they are without it. "It's a hard thing," I said quietly, "to realize the people you love no longer need your permission to build their lives." He nodded, harder than I expected. The honesty in that softened me more than the apology itself had. Harold looked toward the water again. "My father was the same sort of man," he said. "Maybe harder. In his house, respect meant obedience. You didn't question him. You didn't withhold information. You certainly didn't let him feel small. And now I asked..." He gave a tired smile. "Now I suppose I handed that legacy right down the line without thinking about it." I leaned back lightly against the railing. "That's how it usually happens." He looked at me, then genuinely curious. "Why didn't you destroy me in there?" It was such a blunt question that I almost smiled. "I'm sorry." "You could have," he said. "The moment Whitaker saluted you, you could have humiliated me in front of everyone, given a speech, told them exactly who I was, exactly what I'd done. I think they already saw." He winced because he knew it was true. "But that's not an answer," he said. "No," I replied, "it isn't." I looked past him for a moment through the window where I could see Richard inside speaking quietly with Diane. Then I looked back at Harold. "Revenge is satisfying for about 5 minutes," I said. "After that, you still have to live with yourself." He frowned slightly, listening. "I learned a long time ago that correction and humiliation are not the same thing. One teaches, the other only spreads damage." The wind shifted lightly across the terrace. Somewhere below us, halyards tapped softly against a mast. Harold's eyes lowered. "I don't know if I've done much teaching in my life." "Not today," I said. A corner of his mouth twitched despite himself. "Fair enough." We stood there in silence for a moment. Then he said more quietly, "I was wrong about you. But worse than that, I was wrong in front of people I love. My wife, my daughter, my son." He swallowed. "I don't want that to be the last lesson they take from me." That mattered. Because by then I understood what this conversation really was. Not an attempt to erase his shame, not even a plea for forgiveness. It was the first time perhaps in years that Harold was speaking without performing. "You can't undo today," I said, "but you can decide what kind of man you'll be tomorrow." He nodded once firmly. Then after a pause he said, "I'd like the chance to earn your trust. Not because of your rank, because of what you showed me today." That was the closest thing to wisdom I had heard from him. I considered him carefully. Trust at my age is not handed out because someone asks politely, but neither is it withheld forever if change is real. "You can start," I said, "by speaking to Richard honestly, not as a father giving instruction, as a man admitting fault." "I can do that." And to Diane, I added, she's been smoothing over your sharp edges for years. His face shifted. A little shame, a little recognition. Yes, he said, you're right. I usually am. That actually drew a short laugh out of him. Not much, but enough to sound human. He straightened then, not stiffly, but with intention. For what it's worth, Evelyn, your restraint today said more about your character than any title ever could. I met his eyes. That, I said, is the first truly respectful thing you've said to me. He accepted that without protest. Then he gave me a small nod and stepped back toward the doorway. Before he went inside, he turned once more. I am glad my son married you. There was no polish in it. No strategy. Just truth. And because of that, I believed him. After he left, I remained on the terrace for another minute listening to the water and the muffled warmth of the reception behind me. I thought about the strange shape the day had taken, how humiliation had turned into revelation, and revelation into something quieter and harder to earn. Not victory. Not exactly. Something better. Perspective. When I went back inside, Richard looked up immediately and crossed the room to me. You all right? He asked. I am now, I said. He glanced toward the hall where Harold had disappeared a moment earlier. Did he come out here? Yes. And I slipped my hand into his. And I think I said your father may finally be ready to grow up. Richard stared at me for half a second, then laughed, really laughed for the first time all day. And that, more than the salute, more than the shocked silence, more than Harold's apology, felt like the first clear sign that the worst of the day was behind us. By the time the evening began to wind down, the reception had transformed into something I hadn't expected when the day began. It was quieter. Warmer. More honest. The kind of gathering where people leaned in closer when they spoke, where laughter came easier, and where whatever had been shaken loose earlier in the day had settled into something more grounded. The band played softer now. The sky outside had darkened into a deep navy, the kind that reflects faintly off the water like memory rather than light. Guests were beginning to say their goodbyes, lingering hugs, slow handshakes, promises to call to visit, to stay in touch. At our age, you learn that goodbyes are never casual. They carry weight. Richard and I stood near the entrance thanking people as they left. You gave us quite a story to remember, one of the older gentlemen said to me with a small smile. I wasn't aiming for that, I replied. He chuckled. The best stories never are. Another woman squeezed my hand gently. You handled yourself with such grace. Thank you, I said. But I knew grace had not been something I woke up with that morning. It had been built over years through discipline, restraint, and the understanding that not every battle deserves to be fought in the moment it appears. Sometimes the most powerful response is patience. Diane approached us once the last of the guests had drifted out. She looked tired but lighter than she had earlier. I don't think I've ever experienced a day quite like this, she said. I hope that's not a complaint, I replied gently. She smiled. No, I think it's a lesson. She turned to Richard, touching his arm briefly, then looked back at me. I've spent many years keeping peace in this family, she said. Sometimes that meant staying quiet when I shouldn't have. I listened. That changes today, she added. There was a quiet strength in her voice I hadn't heard before. And I believed her. A few minutes later, Harold joined us. Not at the head of the room. Not with an audience. Just beside us. He cleared his throat lightly. Most of the staff is beginning to clean up, he said. I've already spoken to the manager about the final arrangements. It was such an ordinary statement that for a moment I almost smiled. Because it wasn't about control. It was about contribution. A small shift, but a real one. Then he turned to Richard. I owe you something as well, he said. Richard looked at him carefully. You do? Harold nodded. I spoke today as if your judgment didn't matter, as if I still had the right to decide what was best for your life. Richard crossed his arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. I know you meant to protect me, he said. Yes, Harold replied, but protection isn't the same as respect. That was a good line. Not perfect, but honest. I should have trusted you, Harold continued, and I should have respected the woman you chose without requiring her to prove herself to me. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said that would have made today a lot easier. Harold gave a small, rueful nod. Yes, it would have. The three of us stood there together in a kind of stillness that felt New. Not tense. Not fragile. Just unfamiliar. Like a room that had been rearranged after many years and was still settling into its new shape. Finally, Harold looked at me. "I won't pretend I can undo what I did," he said. "But I meant what I said earlier. I would like the chance to do better." I held his gaze. "You'll have that chance," I said. He nodded, accepting that it was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection either. And sometimes that's where real change begins. Later that night, after everything had been cleared and the staff had gone, Richard and I returned to my house by the water. It was quiet again. The kind of quiet I had always loved. He loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table, exhaling deeply. "Well," he said, "that wasn't the wedding I expected." "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." He looked at me, a small smile forming. "But I think it might have been the one we needed." I leaned against the counter, considering that. "Yes," I said, "I think you're right." He rested his arms on the table. "So," he said, "are there any other surprises I should know about?" I smiled. "No more ranks," I said. "That's a relief," he replied. Then more gently, "But I'd still like to hear about your life, when you're ready." I walked over and sat across from him. "I am ready," I said. And for the first time since we met, I began to tell him. Not everything. Not all at once. But enough. About the years of service. About the decisions. About the people I had led and the ones I had lost. He listened without interruption. Without judgment. Without trying to place it into some category he could control. Just listening. And that more than anything told me I had made the right choice. As the night deepened and the conversation slowed, I stepped out onto my porch one last time. The water was dark and still now. The air carried that familiar coastal chill. I rested my hands on the railing and thought about everything that had happened. The insult. The silence. The salute. The apology. The shift. It would be easy to call it justice. Easy to frame it as a moment where truth prevailed and pride was humbled. But life is rarely that simple. What mattered more wasn't that Harold had been proven wrong. It was that he had been given the chance to see it and choose something better. Because in the end, titles fade. Positions end. Even the strongest reputations soften with time. But character is what remains when everything else is stripped away. I turned back toward the house where Richard waited inside. A new chapter. Not perfect, but real. And if there's anything worth carrying forward from a day like that, it's this. Treat people with respect before you know their story. Not after. Because by the time you discover who they are, it may already be too late to show them who you are. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life where patience mattered more than pride, or where understanding came later than it should have, then take a moment to reflect on it. Share it with someone who might need that reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about life dignity and the quiet strength we carry, consider subscribing and staying with us. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones we don't see coming.